Thank you for joining us for this session, which is to launch the 2025 Southeast Asia Social Cohesion Studies Radar Report. And as you know, this is the second time we're doing this. The first time we did it was in 2022, and this study this year is an attempt to sort of build on that work and, of course, to refine and develop it further. But the aim remains very much the same. It's to help us get a good handle on the state and the strength of our social relations across the region. And social cohesion, as we've been talking about for the last day and a half, someone said yesterday, it's complex, it's complicated, it's a nebulous idea, and we're really trying to get a handle on many, many things interrelated. It's a sense of our belonging, the acceptance of our diversity and inclusiveness, our confidence in each other, the trust between people and their leaders and institutions, our shared sense of community and common purpose, our solidarity and willingness to work with and live with each other and to help each other despite our differences. And so this report and the findings, as you'll see in a minute, basically invites us to ponder a few big questions. What is the state of social cohesion in our part of the world? Where is it strong and where is it not so strong? And what factors contribute to fostering it and also to enhance it? And I think the study and the findings you will find in a minute, as my colleagues elaborate on it, relate to a lot of what we've been discussing over the last day and a half. President Taman and this morning Sultan Nazrin Shah have spoken about the troubled times that we live in, the rising tensions amongst our communities, our societies and states, the drift towards polarization and populism, the rise in extremes of nationalism and sectarianism, and new fault lines that are emerging between classes, generations, across haves and have-nots, and between the governed and those who would govern. And you'll find that the study goes into a lot of detail on all of these areas. And it is in that context that we want to present this report, the 2025 Social Cohesion Report. And I have this distinguished panel to help us do that. We're going to start with Dr. Leong, who is the principal investigator of this report, and he is the best person to walk us through the findings. And then Professor Paul Hedges, who was the principal investigator of the 2022 report, will be able to draw similarities and dissimilarities between the two. And then last but not least, Farish is a well-known Southeast Asia hand, well-known to RSIS and to and many of you in this room, will be able to sort of help put the findings in a broader regional context. So without further ado, let me call upon Chan-Hoong, please.
Thank you, Warren. Well, a very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. And I'm here to share with you some of the key highlights of the radar study. And as what Warren pointed out, this is actually based on a national survey, right, of cohesion from 10 ASEAN countries. Now, I know there's a lot of material that I'm going to go through, so don't worry if you miss out any part of it. You can always approach us later after the presentation, and we'll be happy to share with you some of the key research findings. I know time is short, so let me do the contrary, which is to jump into the conclusion first, right, before I go through the details of this. Right, so what are some of the key findings, right, from the 2025 Southeast Asian Social Cohesion Radar? Number one, when we look at the results, what we see is that cohesion, or the state of cohesion, is relatively strong in Southeast Asia, with an average of 72% indicated that cohesion in their own country is relatively strong. Based on the respondents, how they evaluate the quality of ties between different races, between different religions, and between different language groups, generally there's a broad acceptance of cultural diversity within Southeast Asian countries. For example, 7 out of 10 people are confident that people from diverse communities will help each other regardless of the background. Naturally, not everything is rosy. There are always opportunities to do better. And based on the findings, what we can say is that some countries can do more, right, to promote and strengthen institutional trust and perceived policy fairness. And I think that point was kind of reiterated by the keynotes, right? Where are some of the areas that perhaps we as a community can come together and do more? To begin with, Why Southeast Asian Social Cohesion Radar? Why this part of the world? For the benefit of those who are not familiar with Singapore or the region, allow me to give you a very quick overview. Southeast Asia is one of the most diverse as well as dynamic regions in the world. It is home to 700 million people, speak over 200 languages, and all the major faiths and races are all represented here in this part of the world. Now, in spite of this unique cultural landscape, there is no systematic attempt to track the state of cohesion. More importantly, social cohesion is key ingredient for harmony, stability, sense of nationhood, and economic progress, not just for one particular country, but for the region as a whole. So what is cohesion? What is social cohesion? Broadly speaking, cohesion refers to the quality of social ties in societies, how we view the engagement, how we view the relationship with one another and between groups. Social cohesion is both multi-level and multi-dimensional. It is multi-level because it involves many different communities, be that from different races, different religions, different public or private institutions. It is multidimensional because it involves many different types of outcomes, such as trust, cultural identity, or network of friends. Research on social cohesion in other parts of the world uses the Bertelsmann-Sefong framework. This is one of the most commonly cited approach when we look at social cohesion research. In Southeast Asia, because of our diverse cultures and the unique shared history, we want to measure cohesion with an established framework, but also at the same time ensure that the approach considers some of the unique context of this part of the world. To this end, in 2022, we did a pilot study measuring social cohesion with a small sample of 100 thought leaders in each country. The goal is to test bed an instrument that can work here and to customize the questions that will incorporate this region's demography and characteristics. In 2025, this year, we have validated this instrument with an in-depth national samples, interviewing at least 1,000 people in each country, and in total we have more than 10,000. More importantly, we are not just looking at the result survey, we are also looking at how the findings may be triangulated with different inputs from country experts or from some of the discussions that we can see in the online space. So what is the Bertelsmann-Sefong framework, and how do we measure the social cohesion? Cohesion is about social relations between people from diverse races, religions, and language groups, or what we call the horizontal ties. Now here, in terms of social relations or horizontal ties, that can also be decomposed further into more refined dimensions, more refined measures of what it means when you talk about horizontal ties, engagement with different groups. And here we have measures relating to social network, trust in people, and acceptance of diversity. And these are some of the sample questions of that. Now, second, cohesion can also be about connectedness between people and public institutions, or what we call the vertical ties. Now again, this domain can be further decomposed into more refined measurements of what vertical ties means, looking at issue measurements relating to identification, national or cultural identification, looking at institutional trust, and looking at policy fairness. Lastly, social cohesion can also be about the focus on common good, or the sense of civic-mindedness, if you may. Right? And similarly, this is also one where we can decompose that further into different, more refined measurements of civic-mindedness, such as solidarity, respect for social rules, and civic participation. Now, all in all, there are 60 questions in total, and the sample questions are on the right. So the participants will basically rate every single question on a scale of 1 to 5. 1, disagree, strongly disagree, to 5, strongly agree. And broadly speaking, when they indicate that they agree, it means that there is a level of connection and cohesion. Now, we have collected data, right? Due to time constraint, I'm not going to cover the in-depth, so I'm going to show you a very simplified version of the analysis. And here on the figure, you can see at the bottom that we have 10 ASEAN countries, and for each country, we have 4 colored bars: the blue, the orange, the green, and the red. The blue bar represents the overall social cohesion index, the orange bar represents the social relation domain, and the green bar represents the connectedness domain, and lastly, the red bar, the focus on common good. We sum up all the scores, right, from all the items that fall under each domain and dimensions, and collectively that reflects the average percentage of people who rated strong or very strong agreement with the statements. I know, okay, this is the part where we are all very tempted and excited and want to jump into conclusion by looking at, which country may score higher or lower, right? What I want to say here is that it is natural that the social cohesion scores for the 10 countries will be different because all 10 countries are at different levels of economic development, right? So this is perfectly normal. And what is more important is to look not at how the different countries would score, right, on the cohesion measure, but more importantly, on the relative scores of the domains within each country, because that kind of gives us an idea where are the strengths, where are the areas or opportunities for development. So what do we gather, right? So overall, if you look at the blue bar, all the countries score above the midpoint with a regional average of 72%. In terms of social relations, the horizontal ties, there's broadly an acceptance of diversity and inclusion among different communities, be that different races, different religious groups, different language groups, and that represents a solid baseline of trust between diverse communities. In terms of connectedness or vertical ties, the quality of trust between people, public institutions, and the states, if you look at the bars, some of the countries tend to be lower, right? And those are some of the areas where, relatively speaking, vertical ties as compared to horizontal ties tend to be somewhat lower for most countries. Now, lastly, you can also look at the measures in the context of common good, right? So that sense of civic-mindedness within society. And again, some countries will score higher and others can do more to promote that. Another way to conceptualize that will be looking at the typologies of cohesion, right? So here we have 4 different, if you like, typologies of countries, right? The first one is one where there's a fairly robust ties, right? Whether it's horizontal and vertical, right? And countries represent that will be countries like Brunei, Vietnam. The second row represents countries where there's strong mutual respect between diverse communities or the horizontal ties. And here we have Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia as examples. Last but not least, we have a typology looking at the confidence between communities and institutions and the state. Right? So this is the vertical ties, right, between communities and public institutions. And examples of that will be Laos and Cambodia. And finally, a sense of civic-mindedness and participation. Right? And countries that rated higher on that will be Philippines, Thailand, and Myanmar. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is actually my favorite part of the presentation. Now, in analyzing any research instrument, it's always important to check that you measure what you intend to measure. And when we correlate the radar finding with other global indicators, macro indicators, we see a trend, right, and some interesting observations. First, cohesion is correlated with economic development and indicators of stability, right? And this is similar to other global studies on social cohesion, right? Second, if you look carefully at the ordering of the different countries, you realize that something interesting, right? Cohesion here is not related to any political system, whether it's a constitutional monarchy, a democracy, or a communist state. And this is important because it suggests that civil liberties alone does not correlate with cohesion. It's something more than that, right? Not in Southeast Asia. Third, while economic resources like GDP, for instance, can be mobilized to support cohesion, there are other variables that are also important here, right, that you need to consider in when we talk about cohesion, fostering cohesion in societies. So what are the key takeaways? Let me very quickly take you through. Number one, fostering cohesion is a work in progress. It requires continual, proactive engagement between communities, even if we have established strong baseline of acceptance between diverse groups. Second, there are opportunities for public institutions to harness the strength of community ties to foster trust. And local institutions, be that civic or religious bodies, are most familiar with the challenges, the domestic challenges. Policymakers can therefore engage the diverse groups that can help, and that will also signal to everyone that their voices count in making fair policies. Last point, it is also important to seek consensus on priority areas of development, and our preliminary findings suggest that income inequality and rural development are key considerations. This is the last slide, right? And I'd like to bring everyone back to the starting point of this research. Why are we doing this? Why is the social fabric of Southeast Asia matter to everyone in this part of the world? In recent months, we have seen how political and the social climate evolve globally. Stability and peace is a precious commodity. And importantly, sectarian tensions, be that related to race, religion, or political values, do not stop at the geographical border. What is good for one country will benefit another, and what is challenging will also be experienced by your neighbors. And for this reason, right, we want to partner you in the next stage of our radar development to analyze what are some of the culture-specific challenges, to identify drivers of our cohesive norms and the policy levers that can make a difference, and importantly, to understand what are some of the subgroups that will benefit most from multicultural dialogue like ICCS today. So please reach out to us if you'd like to find out more about the radar study, and we look forward to hearing from you. The QR code is on the right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chan-Hoong. Thank you for that very quick overview of the findings. There's a lot of data, but don't worry, you can get all of it on that QR code to go through at your leisure. Believe me, there's a lot of depth to it. And important point that Chan-Hoong makes, the report is not intended as a report card or a ranking across countries, or we don't intend to be making invidious comparisons across them. It's really a snapshot of where we are at a point in time, which we can then track over time and to draw lessons which from all our shared experiences. We'll go into the discussion, but I'd like to draw on Paul next for his thoughts, top-line thoughts on the findings and also how it might compare with 2022.
Thank you very much, Warren. I think I'll talk about three main things. Partly is the comparison with the 2022 survey. I'll also say a little bit about what it is that we think that we're actually measuring when we're doing this. And finally, talk a little bit about religion, because that's my particular sort of academic expertise. So firstly, as I think Warren's mentioned, these are snapshots in time. 2022, of course, we're just coming out of COVID. 2025, there are geopolitical issues affecting us all. Asia Pacific has its own particular sort of instabilities and issues. So we're not saying, like, as you've mentioned, this is the state of these countries. There are things that are sort of moving them both up and down at different times. And of course, coming out of this, some of the countries that have done particularly well on this survey did not do so well in 2022, or it looks that way. And again, sort of the country that came out top in 2022 is not on the top this time. So these snapshots in time is affecting this. And also, of course, who we're talking to. As Chan-Hoong mentioned, the last time we went to the thought leaders, so policymakers, academics, people in business and civil society across various things. And this time it has been an analysis of more grassroots people. And of course, each group is seeing very different things. The grassroots much more connected, but often very locally, whereas sort of, if you like, the thought leaders, sometimes bigger pictures, but not always so connected to some of the issues. So we're making no claims again that this is the truth. These are snapshots in time and snapshots of particular demographics. Of course, we try to make the demographics as representative as we can, but it's never going to be perfect. This is not the reality. It is the best attempt we can get to represent that reality. And also, of course, these are changing all the time. So I've mentioned these two sort of snapshots. Again, maybe 2028. Perhaps we'll be looking at the next one. So many different things can change between now and then. There's no attempt, if you like, to be definitive in what we're saying. Now, perhaps coming on to sort of what it is that we think we're measuring, of course, the Bertelsen stiff tongue thing, we have these 3 domains and 9 dimensions within this. And to some extent, we give them all an equal ranking, but that's not necessarily the case. Perhaps there are certain things, and I think the Sultan, when he was speaking, mentioned that certain aspects of trust between people are perhaps more important than the sort of the vertical ties between sort of government. And of course, from country to country, dependent upon time, this can vary a lot. Of course, with COVID, we saw, trust in sort of institutions incredibly important, but also these horizontal ties are. So it will vary from country to country as to sort of which one of these perhaps sort of more significant. So again, when we do these measurements, we need also to dig down, well, what actually matters in that country, in these communities, as significant there. I'm also somewhat worried about surveys like this, and perhaps to mention, I forget the date, but the first time the Bertelsmann Stiftung did their survey in Asia, they discovered that Hong Kong was the most cohesive society according to their measures. This was shortly before basically everything imploded in Hong Kong, and we saw those sort of demonstrations on the streets and things going badly wrong. And this, I think, gives us a question around this question of resilience. And every time people ask me about social cohesion, I come back to this word of resilience. In the good times, we all get along fine. I mean, this is not a problem. As human beings, we're cooperative animals. It's in our evolutionary history. We cooperate with each other. It's when it gets tested that we really see whether the cohesion is really there, whether the strength and depth is there. And I'm not sure that it is something we are really capturing in these measurements. And of course, how we build that is something not just in Singapore, not just in Southeast Asia. The whole world is struggling with this question at the moment of how we really build resilient ties. Now, we have some indications as to what will help with this, but that's something we all need to work on. Now, if I come down to religion, and we often hear the phrase, religion is important in Asia, and part of what we've done in this is try to make religion more significant than it is in the normal Bertelsmann Stiftung thing, because we're told religion is important in Asia. I'm slightly worried about this, because we're using a colonial Western concept to talk about a colonial Western region. Of course, Southeast Asia is something, and Farish perhaps will talk more about this more, he's the historian of Southeast Asia, is something first the British and, of course, later the Americans created as this sort of middle bit between the East and nothing. It's not a natural area. And equally, religion, as we use this term today, it's something that developed in the West in a particular sort of social and political time, and we use it to talk about the rest of the world. But if we look at Thai Buddhism and its concerns, or Islam in Brunei, or Confucianism in Indonesia, each of these traditions has got very particular political ties, social ties, cultural ties, its own ethics. There's not one thing called religion that sort of maps neatly onto this. So again, we're doing our best with the measurements we've got, but these are not always the best or ideal measures to look and think about this.
Thank you, Paul. I think important point you're making about how social cohesion can rise and fall, it can ebb and flow, and yes. It requires sustained effort and constant tending, which I think the point was made yesterday by the President Taman as well, and by Sultan this morning as well. And the point you're making about the diversity across our region, I think is something that Professor Farish Noor might be able to elaborate on. So let me turn to Farish, please.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to dovetail what Paul has raised earlier. I think the great finding, the utility of a research project like this is that it underscores one very important thing, which is the fact that Southeast Asia is not and has never been a homogeneous region. So what we see, there are many ways we can read the data and interpret the data, but like Paul says, right, it's a snapshot of where we are at the moment. And what this collection of snapshots do is it tells us that every country in Southeast Asia is attempting to address the question of governance in the context of complex societies in its own way. And I think this is hugely important because we are also ASEAN. And I think one of the mistakes that ASEAN did not make from the beginning was to assume a certain universalism where there is a template for all of us to follow. And that's actually saved ASEAN. And I think it says a lot that reports like this are being done by us in Southeast Asia, about Southeast Asia, for Southeast Asians, because it reminds us of the fact that we also need to respect the fact that each of the countries in Southeast Asia will deal with these issues with the tools at hand. And I think that's important. So it starts off on the premise that this is not a universalist claim. We are not heading towards a common goal because we cannot have a common goal. And I don't think we should attempt, people talk about unity. Southeast Asia cannot be a singularity. We've never attempted to create singularity, and I think that's actually dangerous. Yeah? Now, when dealing then with what we are seeing, we look at the landscape today, can I just add a few things? Because of course, this project will continue and there will be other more in-depth, more nuanced surveys done. One factor that we tend to leave out, because political analysts, we look at numbers, we love to crunch numbers and data, but geography. Yeah? And Southeast Asia is actually a very interesting region, because some of the countries, as we saw on the screen just now, some of the countries happen to sit on the ring of fire. And so Indonesia and the Philippines, these are countries that are unfortunately visited by natural disasters. Yeah? The Philippines, I'm told, experiences something like 20 plus typhoons and hurricanes every year. Now, when you look at the survey findings, the level of civic mindedness in the Philippines is extraordinarily high. And perhaps we can also take into account these things, that how our natural environment, things like disasters, COVID was both a divisive and unifying factor, and our very geography itself ought to be taken into account, because of course a project like this requires the participation of not only political analysts and historians, but also sociologists, people who study the politics of geography and things like that. So that's one factor. So how then do we measure? Where are these numbers coming from? Where are the numbers coming from? And if there is a high level of civic mindedness in the Philippines, could it be partly because when disasters strike anywhere, states are often not able to react immediately. When your neighbor's house is on fire, you go in first. You don't wait for the state to come. You have to go in first. Or when your village is flooded, you need to come together and do that. And I think that's extraordinary, because it brings us back to yesterday's discussion, when I think some people, myself included, raised the concern about our tendency in this part of the world, particularly among analysts, to often take a very state-centric approach, to assume that states have to do everything for us. The state at best can be a gardener state. It tends the garden. But social cohesion must come from society itself. It has to be organic, it has to be real. And I think that's something worth pursuing in future studies. Yeah? So I think I agree with Paul. I think as a snapshot, it's actually very telling, because it shows us where we are today. And I think we've come actually a long way. But we need to be cautious when we make certain claims like, oh, we are connected by a common history. People always say, oh, we are connected by the common history of colonialism. True and not true. Because if you make that claim, and I'm a historian of colonialism, yeah? If we make that claim, we are already assuming that colonialism was a homogeneous process for all of us in Southeast Asia. But that's very different, because the British Empire, the Dutch Empire, the Spanish Empire were very different empires with very different modalities of colonialism that then created a host of very different problems that each one of these societies have to deal with. So I've got 10 seconds left. I mean, I think basically what we see is an enormous amount of organic local agency at work. And I think we ought to be appreciative of the fact that, what this does show to us is that on a very ordinary, mundane, day-to-day level, Southeast Asians are actually able to take things, themselves and do things themselves, and that social cohesion, because it's the figures indicate that it's coming organically from society. That's something for us, I think, to be thankful for, if not celebratory. Right.
Well, thank you, Farish. I mean, and thank my panelists for keeping to their time and giving their overview thoughts, because that gives us a lot of time to take questions from the floor, and make this a bit more interactive. The point you're making about the diversity across the region, right? And I think it's an important one, and we don't have one formula that applies to everyone. Yeah. But I think one of the big findings, the overview finding, was that across the region, there is a sense that social relations are not in a bad place. 7 in 10 people feel that they're quite comfortable with their communities accepting diversity, respect for others who are not like them. And that is a pretty good outcome, I think. And from the questions I'm getting, and there are lots of questions, and please keep them coming, and I'll try to sort of group them as we go along. One key question is, what are the underlying factors that lead to this positive outcome? Are there factors that apply across the region, or are there factors which are unique to specific countries that we might learn from each other? Farish, you want to start, and then we work our way backwards?
Okay, I'm going to venture a proposition here. I'm not making any general factual claims here, yeah? But we also see a correlation. We see strong civic-mindedness and social cohesion on a popular, ordinary level, but we also see a slight decline in trust, especially towards state institutions.
Yes.
It could be that the two are actually interrelated. As you trust the state less, you depend on yourself more, and you depend on your friends and neighbors and close associates more, right? And that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's not necessarily a bad thing, because societies need to be resilient on their own, by themselves. That resilience has to come. It's not like taking vitamin C in the morning. You know? It has to come from yourself. And I think that's not necessarily a bad thing. Now, I'm sorry to say this, but I think you also have to remember, this entire region, most of this region, are made up of post-colonial states that are built on the foundations of colonies. Historically, colonies were never democracies, and all colonial powers distrust the natives because you fear native revolt. Yeah? So there's always been this suspicion of people doing things on their own. The fact that a lot of things are actually happening by themselves, you know, on their own in Southeast Asia, and are allowed to, I think points to a certain level of political maturity on the part of the states of Southeast Asia. Because in the end, you have to trust your public. You have to trust your own citizenry. And if people want to create self-help groups or cooperatives or whatever, I think, like I said, the role of the state is not to micromanage. It should be like a gardener. You let the garden grow. And the state, if it's wise, will then identify what are the opportunity structures it can actually encourage so that these civic bonds, you know, grow stronger in time. Of course, ideally, you'd like to see trust at both vertical and horizontal level. But the fact that there seems to be a deepening of trust along horizontal lines is, I think, a very positive thing.
I'd like to take up that point and present it to all three speakers of the difference we find in the report of very strong horizontal relations, but not so strong sort of vertical relations, that sense of trust in institutions, a sense of fairness, you know, is the system working in my favor? And we also heard that yesterday from the Edelman findings, yes, right? The 61% of the respondents saying the system isn't quite working in my favor. And maybe, Chan-Hoong, you could touch on that, the difference between the horizontal and the vertical. What explains that?
I guess there's no one singular explanation for the different observations that you can see. But I do agree with Farish, you know, the fact that, you know, it's actually a very diverse region, and each country has their own experience, right? And for most of the countries, the horizontal ties are fairly robust, I would say, compared to other domains. And I think part of that could be the case that, you know, not a shared history, but the fact that we all understand what is at stake.
Yeah.
Right? Having gone through the last 50 years, and, you know, from time to time, yes, you know, you have some sectarian, you know, disagreement, right, in terms of how racial or religious diversity can be managed. But I think by and large, you know, after 50, 60 years, we kind of have this social compact that, hey, you know, we know what is at stake, right? You know, if you don't get together, you know, then, you know, everybody will be affected. And I think that's where, you know, that strong horizontal ties are built. And as far as the vertical, I think there could be different perspective to that or different interpretation depending on where you're looking at. And if you look at the case of Singapore, I mean, Singapore, I think a lot of Singaporeans are very confident, you know, that the government can manage this, you know, diversity with regards to racial or religious diversity very well, and maybe, you know, a bit more complacent, right? And perhaps explain why, you know, that there's a bit of a disconnect. But in other communities, perhaps you have a different set of explanations in terms of that trust and confidence. So I think what is more important is the case that, you know, that horizontal strength did not kind of filter through, you know, to help uplift the focus on common good. So it's not just horizontal and vertical, but also the focus on common good. And this is the part where I think different communities can, you know, explore what are some of the opportunities to come together and play a bigger role, right, in uplifting the common interests.
Paul, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, talking about the lack of sort of the vertical trust there, I think actually Southeast Asia we're seeing quite high trust in global terms. And again, I think perhaps the Edelman's thing sort of talked about this the other day. There's this huge lack of trust in institutions in many places in the West, where it's shrinking sort of quite low. And so comparatively, sort of on this global sense, it's still quite strong here, which I think comes back to these questions of governance we've talked about as a part of this. You know, there is perhaps a sense of a competence in governance, or you know, they're sort of working for the people. In different ways. So perhaps, you know, again, we're talking about, you know, these low numbers, but, you know, again, if we look in a bigger picture, it's not looking that bad in various ways. And maybe just to build on the sort of the horizontal sort of thing as well. Again, perhaps sort of comparison to the Western sort of context would be useful there. Because through much of history, Southeast Asia has been relatively harmonious. If you like, the different sort of ethnic groups, the different sort of religious groups as they've come here, they haven't come generally as invaders. So sort of we've had sort of the leaders sort of converted, and that's like to change from Hindu to Buddhist into sort of then sort of Islamic sort of majority sort of countries. It hasn't happened with sort of violence. And of course, in Europe and its borders into sort of the Islamic majority world, we've seen the Crusades and these histories of big empires clashing around these sort of religious ethnic borders. And that simply hasn't happened here. So there's sort of like almost sort of millennia of sort of harmony here. Of course, colonialism kind of interrupted that to some degree, and that's where we see a lot of the violence coming out of that. And of course, as Farish has suggested, the aftermath of that has often been these sort of borders that have come with colonialism. But there is perhaps this underlying sort of sense of harmony built, like I said, through, I don't want to say like through the ages, it sounds almost like mystical and stuff, like it's there somehow in the nature of things, which it's not. But there is something here that people have accepted this living together for much longer periods, and it's built again into the society, the histories, the cultures in different ways.
I'd like to take up a point that Farish was making earlier about how shared experiences, you know, whether it's COVID or a natural calamity, does get people working together across state and people sectors, public sectors, and that might engender trust. But is trust necessary to enable them to work together in the first place? You know, which direction does it flow? Without trust, they could be at each other's throats. Yeah. And you need that baseline level of trust so that they can come and work together. So what's your sense? How do you build trust so that you can start working together across state, people, and private sector?
Oh, okay, I think I take your point, but in instances where you have calamities, whether it's a political calamity or a natural disaster, and people turn on each other, I don't think it's simply because of an absence of trust. I think it's also because there is the presence of a kind of me-first survivalist mindset, which I think sadly has become very much hegemonic by now as a result of the kind of consumerist culture that we're seeing all over the planet. So you see this happening, yeah? In certain countries, there's a fire in the city, everybody loots. Instead of putting out the fire, everybody loots the shops. Now, is that an absence of trust, or is that a prevalence of a kind of me-first, selfish, Hobbesian, natural man sort of mindset? I think it's both working at the same time. Whether trust comes first or help comes first, that's the chicken and egg. I think you need both. And I think my question is, where is this trust coming from? Yeah, we do see, the survey indicates that there is trust. So I'm curious as to where that trust comes from. And I think part of the answer goes back to the keynote earlier this morning by Raja Nasrin, right? It's through these very small daily acts. This is Tolstoy. I mean, the daily acts of kindness. This is simply saying good morning to your neighbor establishes a human connection, which, by the way, you cannot do with a state because it's an abstract entity. You don't wake up in the morning and say, hello, state, yeah? But you can say hello to your neighbor. So, because of the political economy we live in today, in the age of late post-industrial capitalism, where there's so much alienation and people feeling lost in huge cities, this need for a human bond is important. So back again to the question of the state. What can the state do? Like I said yesterday, no state can force us to love each other. States can't do that. Yeah? Even if they put a gun to your head, they can't do that. But states can facilitate people who care for each other and sympathize and empathize with one another. And I think to that extent, maybe that's what the states of Southeast Asia got right. Yeah, they correctly identified that, some kinds of social behavior, communal behavior, is actually benevolent, it's good, it's benign, and we can just let it happen by itself, organically. So to go back to your question, which comes first? I think you need both at the same time, but you need the right conditions for that to emerge.
That point you make about it's the everyday action, the smile, the help, that people give, I think was made by President Tharman and also by Sultan Nazrin Shah this morning. And I think it also relates, Chan-Hoong, to one of the recommendations you make in the report, or the group makes in the report, about whether it's possible to use the strong horizontal ties to sort of reinforce the vertical ties, which are not so strong. Tell us about that recommendation,
Sure.
and how you see that playing out.
Sure. I guess if you look at the two perspective on horizontal and vertical, you get away with the assumption that it's just between the two groups. It's two kind of extreme end of the spectrum. But I think there's a lot more that's going on behind that. And the idea is to have policymakers or different communities to engage and to have in the dialogue, to understand where are some of the challenges, and for policymakers to kind of reach out to them and to harness their strength, their understanding of the ground, right, so that they can make and calibrate better policies and interventions. And I think for many of the civic organizations as well as religious bodies, they are the ones who are most familiar with what's happening on the ground. And being able to reach out to them and get them as partners, it will send a very powerful signal to suggest that they're all in this together.
I mean, it relates to, I think, what was said at the previous session by Mr. Peter Ho about that multi-stakeholder work, right? Working across people, public and private sectors and coming together on that social compact. And that's what you're referring to.
It's really about giving a signal, telling everyone that, hey, you know what, we're all in this boat together, right? I mean, Sultan talked about the sail and the wind, but at the end of the day, all of us are on the same boat. Right? And I think this is the part that perhaps at this point, in some societies, in some communities, that idea is not quite aligned, right? And I think some may feel that there's a huge gap between what the policymakers think versus what the civic societies feel. And if both can come together and have this conversation and try to understand what are some of the perspective coming from each, then I think there's a lot more room, right, for the different communities to work together and to see that at the end of the day, we are really on the same boat and we're on the sail and we're trying to catch the next wind. And I think that's a part that probably will contribute, right, to fostering the trust, the vertical ties, and at the same time, also enable different communities, be that different races or different religious groups, to have a better appreciation of the dynamics.
I'm getting lots of questions about the challenges that might be posed to social cohesion, because this is a snapshot at this point in time. But as we heard in the previous session, there are many challenges coming at us, not to mention, least of all, AI, right? And fake news and misinformation. And I was struck by the reference to how there will be 10 billion people, but 100 billion AI agents, which we'll have to deal with. I'd like to hear your thoughts on what you think what impact that might have on social cohesion in this region. And if we look at a snapshot, a study of this sort 5 or 10 years from now, what do you think the impact will be, and how do we sort of mitigate some of those risks? Who wants to start? Paul?
Yeah, maybe I can start on this. I have to say I'm not an optimist about our current situation in the world. If there are some bright spots, one of them is perhaps I think there's now a greater understanding of the need for regulation of social media and AI, and various countries are sort of moving towards this, because we've had this model of the free market out there, that we just let these things happen and somehow the free market will ensure that everything is best. And it's quite obvious now the free market is not a good idea. It does not work in the best interest of people. It often works against our best interests, particularly as these things become sort of monetized in various ways. So the fact that now I think governments, particularly Europe, I think is very clear on this. In Southeast Asia as well, we're seeing this here. So various parts of the world are moving, I think, quite heavily towards this. And of course, it will take international cooperation because of the connectedness. No one country can do this on their own. Again, I think President Farman mentioned this, so that's a key part of this. I think also perhaps, if you like, our current sort of system as part of this, because we've been talking about this question of sort of the grievances out there, and there's 61% of people across the world who have a sense of sort of grievance. Partly, I think, yes, there's a worry about this, the fact that there are so many people who have a grievance about this. But there's also actually, I see, something we can see is quite optimistic about this. Because we live in a world that's dominated by a form of imperialistic neoliberal capitalism that is often is working for the elites and is not working for the common people. People can, now we've seen this, the corporations can come to the lobbyist door. Of course, the Mayor of Rotterdam was telling us this morning, the lobbyist is always there at his door, but how do you get to the people on the ground? And so we live within a political system, a financial system that is geared against ordinary people. So again, this sense of grievance is a positive thing, that we might have that energy to push back against this. So while I said I'm not optimistic, I think there are sort of some things out there which might give us grounds to say, well, now we're identifying these problems, this can lead us on as to where sort of between policy makers, with civil society, with the public, we can work together to seek to do something better.
Any thoughts, Farish?
Just to add to Paul, and I'm even more pessimistic, if I can start with an anecdote. I think the saddest thing I've seen in my entire life was when I was in Japan in a university, and with my colleagues in the canteen, I saw a young man talking to what I thought was his girlfriend on his phone. It was a very animated conversation, and I said to my colleagues, he's very much in love, this young man. And then they said, Farish, he's talking to an app. And I thought that was so profoundly sad, that this young man in his 20s was no longer capable of having a conversation with an actual human being. So we are looking at the state of human, cohesion between human beings, and how it develops organically. You may hate your neighbor because you don't like the food he cooks, or his karaoke is too loud or whatever. But if his house is on fire, you can't switch off. You will do something. But we are looking at a genuine generational change, where an entire generation of young human beings are being nurtured in a different way, where their communication is less personal. You have to deal with actual complex human beings who have facets that you may like or not like, but in the end, that's how we build meaningful relationships and friendships. So my concern, if we were to do this survey 2 years from now, 4 years from now, 6 years from now, as this younger generation proliferate, in numbers, are we going to see changes? Because this cohesion that we are seeing now, that is horizontal, is clearly between human agents. But when AI comes in, and so much of what's happening now in my world, in academia, is being dominated by artificial intelligence, will these human bonds become more brittle, more weak, and more superficial? Now, when that happens, coupled with the distrust, or the decline in trust for institutions and states, now that's not a happy picture. That's not where we want to go. So I think it's very important that we take the implications of AI very, very seriously. Because of course, fake news is a threat, and propaganda and all that. We know that. But at the more mundane level, like I said, if our interaction is no longer on a person-to-person, community-to-community basis, where we have to actually work out our differences. You don't have to work out your differences with an artificial girlfriend, because you can program her to accept whatever you say, right? Now that's dangerous. And that's like video games that today are designed to make sure you can only win. That's how the video game industry works. You can't lose, because it's giving you the dopamine hit. And that basically means we're looking at a younger generation that's hooked up, that's hooked on, this constant positive affirmation, regardless of consequences, regardless of your own subject position. And I think that's not a happy place. Yeah. So it'll be very interesting to see the survey being repeated, in the years to come. Because if we start seeing a shift, then there might be some truth to what Paul and I have been saying.
Chan-Hoong, what's your sense?
When we were doing this study, we actually reached out to a few social media giants to find out about the profile and the users and so on. and we were told that Southeast Asia is actually the largest consumer of social media platforms. And I think that's quite true because I think sometimes it's faster to get a response from them via Facebook than via the email that we send them. So I mean, that tells us a bit about the, the nature and the kind of consumption habits. But more importantly, I think this is the part where when it comes to technology and digitalization, a lot of that can come to the, how you regulate that platforms, to ensure that, that is one that will not affect the social fabric. But I think more importantly, it's also how we engage the public, right, to raise the public awareness on how all these social media platforms will shape the kind of behaviors, the rituals. And going back to Farish's point, I mean, indeed, whether there are cases where you have more and more people who are talking to the robots as opposed to talking to real people, and how would you ensure that, the algorithms, the AI, the large language model, do not have a corrosive element attached to that will affect the social fabric. And those are some of the emerging challenges that we have to deal with, and to ensure that even as the way we engage different communities evolve, there are mechanisms in place, be that policies that regulate some of the social media giants, or to raise that horizontal strength, the awareness among people on what are some of the dangers, right, when you are on social media platforms.
Well, I think rather than being pessimistic, we can take the advice from the earlier speakers of invoking Dolly Parton and recognizing that we can't change the wind, but we can shift our sails. So to be nimble and agile in adjusting to those changes, as you say. There's a question that's directed specifically to you, Chan-Hoong, which is the point you were trying to make about the diversity across our region and the difference in systems and politics, and how it's more about governance rather than the type of system that it determines social cohesion. So maybe you could elaborate on that.
Absolutely. When you look at the scores of all 10 countries and then you try to map it with other indicators of stability, of governance, and governance performance and effectiveness, I think what you do see here is that it's not so much about that so-called institutional systems that you have in place, but really about the quality of the governance. Right? Whether the policies that you have ensure that different groups are treated fairly, whether they have access to resources, and I think those are the things that really matter, because at the end of the day, I think most people, ordinary citizens, are more concerned about the bread and butter issues to ensure that they have the resources, the opportunities, and less so on what will be the formal political systems that you have. And I think those are important when we consider the idea of cohesion, because that civil liberties alone doesn't necessarily guarantee that you have mutual respect. It doesn't guarantee that you have access to opportunities and resources. And when we talk about social cohesion, I think that's where we really need to look at the region and the unique context that we share, right? When we consider what are some of the factors that will shape our cohesive norms.
The previous session, we had a very nice analogy of oasis rather than fortifications, right? And the oasis is a place where there are rules, but people get to shape those rules. And that's about civic participation and governance as well, where people come together to shape the outcomes, I suppose.
It's about opportunities to flourish.
Yes. Yes. Farish, you look like you want to say something to that.
I wanted to add to that. I think another thing that the survey shows is that there's no correlation between wealth and civic participation and harmony either. I think that's very, very important. It's very important because in academic circles, it actually challenges, if not refutes, one unstated assumption in development theory. Like, so you develop, you become rich, you get money, you shop until you die happy, right? And that doesn't happen. And Southeast Asia seems to show that actually it's not your GDP, it's not your yearly income that actually guarantees this. It's other things. It's these intangibles that, okay, I sound like a Hallmark postcard now, but these are things that money can't buy. But it is literally that. It's that smile from your colleague, it's that wave from your neighbor. And these things, I mean, we tend to sweep this aside because we've all become jaded and cynical and all that, but these things actually do matter. And to go back to the point earlier about a virtual existence. Yeah. A thumbs up on your WhatsApp is not the same thing, right? It's not an actual handshake. And I think this is something that is very important. We've lost our tactile memory, you know. And people can go on for days without actually shaking the hand of another human being or actually going to the fence, having an actual chat with your neighbor, you know. And I think when that happens, that's when we need to get worried, you know. But the point about the absence of a correlation between wealth and cohesiveness, I think is important. Because it also means that you may not be doing well economically as a country, but you don't have to give up, because your social bonds might actually be stronger than you realize.
Mm. Well, I mean, but governance is also at multiple levels, right? It's not just the state. It's and individuals, as employers, as colleagues, we have agency, right? The finding yesterday from the Edelman report, which said 20% did not want to work with or live with people who were different from them. Yeah. And I think, but as an individual, as an employer, as a colleague, we can make a difference by showing that we are accepting of diversity and inclusiveness, and we want our workplaces and our societies and our communities to be a very different kind of place, which is socially inclusive. So I think we can make a difference. We're kind of running out of time, and I'm conscious that we have to maintain social cohesion and harmony by making sure you have your lunch. So I'm going to wrap things up by asking my panelists, out of the many thoughts and ideas and findings, can you pick one? Out of many, just one. In a phrase, in a word, in a thought, in a finding, that what is it you would take away from this year's social cohesion report that you would like to share with this audience, or that you would apply in your own space? Start with Farish, and then we'll give Chan-Hoong the last word.
I'm not ready. I think, as someone who studies Southeast Asia, I think what the report really reminds us, and it needs to be said again and again and again, that as Paul said, Southeast Asia is an unnatural construct. There's no particular reason that the countries of the region ought to think of themselves as a region. But what the report does show is that within this region, you know, we actually see very real diversity that makes it imperative on us to be cautious, I think, of making these kind of universal, you know, claims. I'm glad, like I said, I'm glad that we are not attempting to create any kind of universal model or template for the whole region. And I don't think we should ever do that, because that will be actually more detrimental than helpful.
Paul?
I'd like to pick up on something that's been mentioned already, the fact that it's not money, it's not modernity that is leading to this sort of social cohesion. This doesn't give you happiness. In this, again, a lot of development theory does this. And again, a lot of the studies, particularly in the West, of social cohesion, it looks like this. The more money you have, the happier you have. Mm-hmm. But again, like, you know, in the good times, yes, people are doing well, and that doesn't really tell us that much. But of course, a lot of sort of modernity, there's individualism built into this as well. Mm-hmm. And that's breaking away those bonds, as far as like people are going back into their houses. So the richer, the more modern, the more westernized we become in various ways, it actually can be quite harmful to this. And we're seeing on the top of this some of the countries like the former communist countries, which are much more cohesive in many ways, and we haven't really mentioned that, actually do score extremely well. And that's what I think is quite interesting for us.
Chan-Hoong, you have the last word with 46 seconds to go. Yes.
Thank you. We pour through many indicators, you know, looking at the 10 ASEAN countries, and there are a lot of differences. But I think the key takeaway for me is that in spite of all those differences, it doesn't necessarily mean that societies will be divided or polarized. Mm-hmm. I think what's more important is to have that social compact between the different communities, to understand that, you know, we've gone through a long journey. No doubt from time to time there might be some differences, but at the end of the day, you know, we all understand, you know, what is good for all of us. And I think this is a part that, to me, is particularly, you know, heartening, because it's an important takeaway to know that this region has gone through so much in the past, and there's so much to look forward to. And the next 10, 20 years is really how can we fine-tune that, you know, to foster stronger trust, institutional trust, and where are some of the areas where you can encourage different communities to step forward and to contribute and make a difference.
You sound like you're ready to start working on the next report.
Absolutely.
But in the meantime, please download the full report from the QR code and study it. And as Chan-Hoong said, we are eager to sort of partner with people to sort of develop it and take the study forward. But please join me in thanking my panelists for this.
And thank you, Mr. Warren Fernandez, for moderating.